Hello, my fellow creature enthusiasts. Welcome back to my channel, or if you're new, thanks for joining me. Today, we'll take a look at the classic werewolf and the modern version of the werewolf to compare them and rate their monster designs on our creature scale. Which version of the werewolf is your favorite? Let me know in the comments down below. There will be spoilers ahead for both movies. What do you think each werewolf did in their impossible situations? Let's find out. The Werewolf of London is a classic movie that was released in 1935. We're taken to Tibet where we meet a botanist named Wilfred Glendon and his assistant Hugh Renwick in search of a strange flower called the phosphorescent wolf flower that only grows in Tibet and that only blooms in the moonlight. They are warned by the locals that the valley where the flower lives is full of demons, but do you think that they listen to their warnings? Of course not! Our brave explorers don't believe in silly superstitions, so they hike over the ridge to the valley, and along their way they hear a wolf howling as they get closer and closer. Ow! They reach the valley and find the flower, but a werewolf has been stalking Wilfred and watching him from behind some rocks as he's trying to collect the flower. So he's going about his business when he suddenly notices a shadow against the rock wall next to him moving around. So what does he do in this situation? Well, he does what most curious people would do, which is to go towards the rocks and see what's there. And to his surprise, out pops this werewolf that launches himself at Wilfred and goes into attack mode. They start to fight, and in the struggle, the werewolf bites him on the arm, but then Wilfred manages to get the upper hand and stab him with a knife, which causes the werewolf to run away in pain. Successful in his conquest, Wilfred returns home to London and takes the flower to his lab for testing. Shortly after, he meets the mysterious Dr. Yogami at a party being thrown by the Botanical Society. Dr. Yogami tells him that the flower that he found is an antidote for werewolfery, also known medically as lycanthrophobia. After his encounter with the werewolf in Tibet, do you think he's more open to the idea of werewolves being a real thing? Of course not, he's a man of science after all. Wilfred tells him that he doesn't believe that a man afflicted by that condition actually becomes a werewolf under the full moon. That'd just be ridiculous. The doctor tells him that the werewolf isn't a man and isn't a wolf. It's a satanic creature with the worst qualities of both beings. Wilfred laughs at him and tells him he stopped believing those kinds of things when he was 6. But the doctor tells him that it doesn't change the fact that in London right now, there are 2 werewolves that he knows of. Wilfred decides to humor him just a little bit by asking how the men got in the first place, and he tells him that they got it from being bitten by another werewolf, and that those who are bitten are doomed, but that the flower could help them. He leaves the party, but tells Wilfred that he'll be back to see him again. The next day, Wilfred is in his lab trying to make the flower bloom with artificial moonlight, and it works, but as his hand is hit by the moonlight, it starts to transform and gets hairy. He's caught off guard by it, but he hides it quickly before his trusty lab assistant Hawkins can see it. He tells Hawkins to get out of the lab to go get himself some dinner or something and hurries him out. Once he leaves, he knows that it's not a normal case of spontaneous hairy hands that he could just shave away. In that situation, what do you think he did? Well, he remembered that ridiculous conversation with Dr. Yogami and decides to put it to the test. He cuts a flower off the plant and squeezes some of the stem juice onto his hand, and a few moments later, his hand is normal again, and he's surprised that it actually worked. Later that day, Dr. Yogami goes to see Wilfred. But Wilfred tells him that he's not accepting visitors, so that he should come back another day, but the doctor insists that it can't wait another day and tells him that it's important because that night is the first night of the full moon. Wilfred asks him why he keeps going on about those old wives' tales, and he tells him that he wishes it was made up, but it's not. The doctor tells him that he needs to give him 2 blossoms from the flower so that they can save 2 people when night falls. Wilfred's confused and asks him what he means by that, because he thought he told him it was a cure, but he tells him that it's just an antidote and that it only works for a few hours, but that it's not a cure. The doctor wants to see the results of his experiment, but he shuts him down and tells him that he'll have to wait to see the results when everyone else does, and tells him to leave. But before he leaves, the doctor gives him a warning that the werewolf will instinctively seek to kill the thing it loves the most. Later that night, the full moon rises and Wilfred transforms into a werewolf. So he goes to his lab to get a blossom, but he sees that someone has stolen the 2 that he managed to make bloom. Wilfred's wife Lisa is at a dinner party at her aunt's house with her childhood friend Paul. He heads over to where the party is in his werewolf form, but puts on a scarf, hat, and coat to hide his appearance. And as he gets closer, the guests can hear him howling, but they think it's just some dog making noise. His howls are getting more frequent with each step that he takes, as he gets closer and closer, and the guests are getting nervous. Ow! Upstairs, Lisa's Aunt Eddie is sleeping off one too many drinks. Outside, Werewolf is climbing the fence into the yard of Eddie's house and climbs up to her open window and tries to attack her. The guests downstairs hear her scream, so the men rush upstairs to help her. When they reach her, she's alone and scared, and says a hairy devil with green eyes tried to claw at her. Nobody believes her though, and they just think she was seeing things just because she was drunk. Werefred runs away, but he sees a girl walking alone on an empty street and decides to introduce himself, and by that I mean he killed her. The next day, the murder of the girl is front page news in the newspaper. Dr. Yagami looks upset after reading the newspaper, and his maid points out the 2 flowers on his desk and notices that one of them is dead now, and that they are kind of a flower that she's never seen before. Now we know that he's the one who stole the flowers, but why and for what purpose? Paul goes to visit his uncle Thomas, who's the chief of police, and sees the newspaper on his desk and decides to read it, and says to his uncle that it looks like the attack happened close to Eddie's house, and that there are wounds on the woman's throat that look like they were made by an animal. Paul tells his uncle that they heard what sounded like a wolf howling in the night, but the uncle says that there's no way that there's a wolf on the loose in London. Paul says, then let me suggest something crazy, and tells him maybe it's a werewolf. But his uncle just laughs at the suggestion and tells him that this is real life and not a fairy tale. But Paul tells him that human knowledge is limited and that we don't know everything about our world. He looks at his uncle and tells him, just hear me out, and goes on to tell his uncle about a trip that he took to Yucatan last year, where the police were having the same problem with murders like the one that happened last night. And before every murder, they would hear a wolf howling, but that one night they shot something sneaking through the hills, and after that, the murder stopped, and they said it was a werewolf. His uncle just laughs at him and scoffs at the idea of it being true, and that his nephew would even believe in such a thing. On the second night of the full moon, Wilfred tries to put some physical distance between him and his wife so he doesn't hurt her, and ends up going to rent a room in town. He's feeling alone and falling into despair, and he's praying and wishing with all his heart and all his might that he doesn't transform that night. But sadly, his pleas are not answered, so he transforms into Werefred and jumps out of the window and heads to a zoo. Once there, he sees the zoo guard making out with his mistress, but the wolves in the zoo start acting up, so the guard leaves the woman by herself to go check on them. Seeing her by herself, Werefred goes on the attack and kills her. The next day, we see that Dr. Yagami has used up the second flower bud. Shortly after, Dr. Yagami calls Thomas to tell him about the attacks being werewolf attacks, and that he needs him to confiscate the werewolf plant from Wilfred because it's the only one in London and it's the only antidote for werewolves. Thomas doesn't take him seriously and is trying his best to hold back his laughter, but the doctor warns Thomas that if he doesn't get that plant and find a way for it to grow in their country, that will turn into an epidemic and it will destroy all of London. On the third night of the full moon, Wilfred decides to go isolate himself in his wife's parents' estate to hopefully keep himself from hurting anyone. So he instructs the groundskeeper to lock him in a room in the house that looks a bit like a dungeon and tells him not to let him out until after sunrise. Little does he know, though, that his wife and Paul have decided to visit her family's house for old time's sake and are headed there as he's transforming into Werefred. He spots them through the barred window and he ends up breaking off a bar and escaping from the room. He attacks his wife, but she's saved by Paul and they escape from him. The next day, Paul goes to talk to his uncle and tells him that he knows who the werewolf is and tells him that it's Wilfred. But his uncle doesn't believe him and still doesn't believe the whole werewolf nonsense. Since his uncle's not being very helpful, what do you think Paul told Lisa to do? Well, he did what any brave man in that situation would do. He got Lisa's Aunt Eddie to go stay with her at the house and told them to lock all the windows and doors because that would obviously be the most effective thing to do to protect them, because leaving 2 defenseless women alone is better than leaving only 1 defenseless woman alone instead. I feel like maybe, I don't know, he could have gotten some weapons and just been there to protect her himself because, he says that she's his very important childhood friend that he loves and yet he left her safety in the hands of fate. That totally makes a lot of sense. Anyway, an officer informs the uncle that another murder took place at a hotel 150 miles away from where his nephew fought with Werefred, and his uncle tells him there's no way that he could have attacked him and someone else around the same time across that vast distance, so he can't possibly be a werewolf. They go to the hotel where the maid in the hotel was killed, and when they get there, they find that the room she was in is a total wreck, and they notice that she was killed in the exact same way as the last murder victims. When they ask whose room it is, they find out it was Dr. Yagami's. Then as they're looking around, they find the 2 flowers in the wastebasket, and so they head to Wilfred's manor to go talk to the Mr. and Mrs. But when they get there, they can't find Wilfred, so the police start searching for him and searching for Dr. Yagami, but they can't find either one of them. Wilfred returns to his lab in secret, and Hawkins tells him that the flower is about to bloom, so he goes in to get the flower, but Dr. Yagami sneaks in behind him, and while his back is turned, he cuts the flower off and uses it up before Wilfred even realizes what's happening. He has a sudden moment of clarity and realizes that the werewolf that bit him in Tibet was actually Dr. Yagami, and said that it's all his fault that all this stuff happened to him. Dr. Yagami tries to run away, but Wilfred is enraged and attacks him, so they start fighting and it becomes a battle of life and death. But in the middle of their fight, Wilfred turns into Werefred and kills the doctor. He leaves the lab and tries to break into the house where his wife is. He makes it inside, but then he spots Paul outside and sees the police arriving and attacks Paul. But then he sees his wife again and then goes after her again. And as he's getting closer to his wife, she realizes who he is and tries to get him to remember who she is. But he still continues slowly walking towards her, but the police arrive and shoot him before he can reach her. He thanks the police for shooting him because it was the only way to stop him, because he couldn't control himself or help what he was anymore, and he got to say goodbye to his wife, and then he dies, and turns back into a human right in front of everyone, and Thomas finally believes, and then the movie ends. An American Werewolf in London is a modern movie that was released in 1981. In a remote place in the northern English countryside, we see 2 men backpacking. Their names are David and Jack. They're walking down a road headed towards a village called East Proctor. They feel really cold and the night is starting to fall across the land. They luckily come across a pub, or just maybe it's unlucky that they found it. The pub is called the Slaughtered Lamb, and they decide to go in and get warm and escape the cold. They are hoping to maybe get something warm to eat and drink, but once they enter, everyone stops what they're doing and just stares at them very seriously for a few minutes before they go back to whatever they were doing before. Talk about a cold reception, am I right? Brr. They ask the bartender if they could come in out of the cold, and she nods yes, but she lets them know that they don't serve any food or hot drinks, but that she could make them some hot tea if they'd like. They notice a 5-pointed star painted on the wall with a candle on either side of it. They're curious about it, so they ask the pub goers what it's for, and the moment they do, everyone again stops what they're doing and stares at the 2 men seriously, as if they just asked them if they could kill their sheeps or something. Both men decide to take that as their cue to leave, but the bartender says that they shouldn't go, but the pub goers tell them to leave, and tell them to stay on the road, and not to go near the moors, and to beware of the moon. Both men step back into the cold and start walking down the road in hopes of maybe finding an inn to stay at for the night. But do you think they found one? Of course not, at least not with their kind of luck. Instead, they find that they've walked off the road and are close to the moors, and that it just so happens to be a full moon. They suddenly hear the sounds of a wolf howling, and decide that they should just head back to the pub, even if they aren't really welcome there. But they're lost and don't know how to get back, and they can hear the sounds of a wolf circling them. Suddenly, a werewolf jumps out and attacks Jack. What do you think David did in that situation? He of course fought bravely and tried to get the beast off his friend just like a true hero of epic proportions. Just kidding, he runs away like a coward instead of helping Jack, and after making it a short distance decides to go back and help him, but it's already too late because Jack has already been mauled to death. His insides are now his outsides, and any chance of him ever being a model is gone, just like his face. All he sees is his friend dead on the floor, torn to ribbons, and then he himself is attacked by the werewolf. But fortunately for him, the people from the pub come to help and shoot the werewolf. David survived with some lacerations and minimal blood loss, but just as he loses consciousness, he sees the werewolf turn back into a human that has more holes in him than a wiffle ball. Later, he wakes up in a hospital in London and sees Dr. Hirsch, who works at the hospital, accompanied by a man named Mr. Collins, who's from the American Embassy in London, and they inform him that he's been unconscious for 3 weeks and that his friend Jack is dead, and that both their parents have been notified about what happened to them. He starts to get hysterical, saying that he wants to see Jack, and they say there's no need to get hysterical, so they sedate him to calm him down. I mean, because of your best friend dying and then the way that it happened, it's obviously not traumatic enough to warrant any kind of hysterics whatsoever. Mr. Collins tells him that the police want to interview him and that he gave them permission to do it. Police officers go by and talk to him and tell him that the witnesses say that they were attacked by an escaped lunatic. But David tells him that it's not true. They were attacked by a big wolf. But they don't believe him and say that the man who attacked them was killed in the act anyway, so the case is closed. And they tell him that he's probably just remembering things wrong because he went through a traumatic experience. David still thinks they're wrong, but there's nothing he can do about it. Still at the hospital, David starts to have odd and scary nightmares and talks to Dr. Hirsch about them and tells him again that they weren't attacked by a man, they were attacked by an animal. But the doctor doesn't believe him and tells him that if there was a monster roaming around in northern England, that they would have seen it on the television by now. Do you believe that's true, that something that is happening in a more remote part of the country would be found so easily? He tells him that he'll be discharged from the hospital in 3 or 4 days, so that he should at least try to remain sane until he's no longer their responsibility. Wow, now that's the kind of doctor who cares very much about his patients. He tells the doctor that he doesn't want to be alone, so he tells him that he'll send someone to keep him company. He ends up sending Nurse Alex Price, and they start to get close. The ghost of Jack appears to him in his room and tells him that they were attacked by a werewolf. Why do you think that Jack is appearing to him, though? And is Jack even there to begin with? Or do you think it's all just in his head? Jack goes on to tell him that he's undead and is stuck in limbo because he died an unnatural death and is forced to walk the earth until the werewolf curse is lifted by severing the bloodline, but that until then he isn't allowed to rest. He drops a huge bombshell on David by telling him that he's the last werewolf and that he needs to do the selfless thing and kill himself so that he doesn't kill other people and so that he can finally rest in peace instead of being forced to stay undead. David doesn't believe him and thinks that he's just having another bad dream. Can you imagine how horrible it would be to have your best friend that died a horrific death that you miss a lot tell you that you need to kill yourself for his sake and everyone else's? That's just so devastating and a huge punch to the gut for anyone. David starts crying as anyone would after hearing that and calls for the nurse. Jack tells him not to cry and to beware of the moon, and then he disappears. Nurse Alex enters the room and tries to calm David down, and he ends up suddenly kissing her and tells her that he's a werewolf. But she doesn't know what to say to that, so she just asks him if he's okay, and he tells her that he doesn't know but that he'll let her know at the next full moon. She tells him that he's being discharged from the hospital tomorrow and asks him if he'll be alright, but he doesn't answer the question. He instead tells her about his friend Jack that was just there, and then she asks him if it was his dead friend Jack, and he tells her yes, and that he was there to tell him that he's going to become a monster in 2 days, and he asks her what she thinks, and she just tells him that maybe he was just having a bad dream again, and he agrees. She asks him if he has anywhere to stay in London, and since he doesn't, she invites him to stay at her place. They head to her apartment and she gives him a tour of it, and tells him that she finds him attractive, and tells him that he might want to watch TV while she takes a shower. That obviously didn't happen because we end up seeing them together in the shower, getting intimate, and after that they get even more intimate in her bedroom. After they finish their horizontal mambo, they fall asleep in each other's arms. Later that night, we see that David gets up to use the bathroom, but he soon realizes that he has a guest in the bathroom with him. Can you guess who it is? If you happen to guess Jack, then you're correct. Jack appears to him there, but he's looking more decomposed than before. David tells him that he's not real, but Jack isn't fazed and tells him to follow him, so David does, and they go into the living room to sit down and talk. David asks him why he's there, and Jack tells him that he wanted to see him and that he's sorry for upsetting him, but that he's there to warn him that tomorrow is the full moon. and that he's going to change. David tells him that he knows and wants him to go away, but Jack tells him again that he needs to kill himself before it's too late. David tells him that he doesn't believe him and thinks he's just having another bad dream, but Jack tells him it's very real and that he needs to believe him because he's going to end up killing people and making them undead just like him, and tells him that being stuck as he is isn't fun, and tells him again that he needs to take his own life, but David says he doesn't accept that and just wants him to go away, but Jack warns him that it's not pretend, and then he disappears. Do you think that what Jack is telling him is true? Is he really just doomed? Alex wakes up and asks him if he's alright because she heard voices, and he tells her that it was just him being crazy, and she tells him to come back to bed, and he asks her if she thinks he's crazy, and she doesn't answer the question, but she obviously thinks that he's madder than a hatter. She instead asks him what's wrong, and he tells her that he saw Jack again, and that he told him that he's going to turn into a monster tomorrow night. And she asks him if he believes him, and he doesn't answer that, but asks her if she believes him about seeing Jack, and she says she believes that he's upset and that maybe he's seeing his friend because he loved him very much and blames himself for his death. The next day, we see Dr. Hirsch visiting the pub where David and Jack went on the night they were attacked 2 weeks ago. When he asks them about the attack that happened in the area, they pretend not to know anything. They ask if he's a police officer, and he tells them that he isn't one, but that he's a doctor, and that he works at the hospital where they treated David, and tells them that he had been talking about werewolves and monsters, and that since he happened to be in the area, he thought he would just check out his story. The pub patrons just give a light laugh at the absurdity and basically tell him who would believe in werewolves. We obviously don't believe in that here. Oh yeah, there's definitely nothing suspicious going on there, because it's not like you're all just looking at each other super nervously and acting super shady. He tells them that he has to go now since he has a long drive back ahead of him. It's raining hard outside, and as he's about to open his car door, he notices that one of the pub patrons is outside staring at him. So he goes up to him and says hi, and the man proceeds to tell him that David is in danger, and not just him, but others will be too. He says it's almost the full moon, and so that he'll change, but just as he's about to say more, another guy from the pub comes out and is angry and yells at him to shut up, and so the man runs away, and the guy who yelled at him just walks off in a huff. The doctor's left there just standing there feeling confused. Meanwhile, we see Alex leaving for work and saying goodbye to David. David goes back into the apartment and tries to relax, but he's feeling anxious. As night falls and the full moon rises, he feels like he's burning up and is drenched in sweat, so he removes all his clothes until he's just in his birthday suit. He suddenly starts undergoing the transformation into a werewolf. He looks like he's in a lot of pain and so much agony as his bones move under his skin and rearrange themselves, and as the hair sprouts and his teeth grow longer and thicker, and his skull and his skeleton structure is changed completely. After he's done transforming, he heads out into the night and attacks and kills a couple in a park. We see the doctor at the hospital looking for Alex to ask her if she's seen David since he left the hospital, and she tells him that he's been staying with her, and so he asks her to go with him to his office. Once in his office, he tells her that he went to the area where David was attacked and that he's worried about him, especially because of the full moon. So he asks her where he is now, and she tells him that he's at her apartment. He asks her if he's still talking about werewolves, and she answers his question with a question and asks him what's wrong, and if it's more serious than she knows. And he goes on to tell her that he tried to investigate the attack on David and Jack, but that there were no records of it, and that the case was closed, and that the file was supposedly misplaced. Do you really think it was misplaced, or was it a cover-up? I smell a conspiracy. He tells her that David's wounds were cleaned and dressed before he arrived at the hospital, despite the locals saying that he wasn't seen by any doctor. So he decided to go to the pub where they went the night of the attack and became convinced that the villagers were lying about there being any witnesses and about an escaped lunatic, and so he says that the whole community there is hiding the truth about what happened out there. He says he doesn't think it's a werewolf, that he thinks that the villagers do, and that their belief probably got David to believe it too. The doctor thinks that it's basically just the power of suggestion that's making David believe that he's a werewolf, and that he'll change on a full moon. And if he believes that, he might go into a deranged state that might cause him to hurt himself or others. Sounds like the old saying, I think, therefore I am. Meanwhile, we see 3 homeless men, and they hear a wolf howling, and see the werewolf. Do you think it killed them? Next, we see a man that just got off a subway train in an empty station, and he hears growling and feels like someone is following him. Then he sees it's a werewolf and starts trying to run away, but he's easily caught and killed. The next day, David wakes up naked at the zoo in the wolf enclosure and is confused and afraid. He manages to climb out, but since he's naked, he's trying hard to hide, so he isn't spotted while trying to make his way out of the zoo. He manages to steal a lady's coat and make his way back to Alex's apartment. When he walks in, she asks him where he's been, and he tells her that he woke up in a zoo and he doesn't remember what happened last night. She tells him that she was worried about him because she didn't know where he was. She then gets a call from the doctor, and he asks her if he's back yet, and she tells him yes, but that he says that he woke up in a zoo and doesn't know how he got there. The doctor asks her if he's acting strange, and if she's sure he's lucid, and she tells him that he is. The doctor tells her to bring him to the hospital right away because he wants him in his care, so they get in a taxi and head over there. But in the middle of the ride, the driver mentions 6 murders that happened in different parts of the city, where all the victims were mutilated, and says that the killer must be a maniac. After hearing that, David tells the taxi driver to pull over, and he gets out of the car. He's very upset and hysterical and says he believes Jack now and wants to turn himself into the police because he killed those people and must be a werewolf. But Alex tells him to just be rational and go to Dr. Hirsch instead. He ignores her and spots an officer up ahead and tries to get arrested, but the guy just won't arrest him. He gets so frustrated and upset that he lashes out at Alex and starts arguing with her, but in the middle of their argument, he tells her that he loves her, but that he has to stay away from her. He kisses her and runs away after. Do you think he made the right decision? Is happiness really impossible for him? Shortly after, we see Alex talking with the doctor and the 2 detectives from before, and the detective tells them that they'll try to find David before nightfall, but that he doesn't think that David's connected to any of the murders from last night. David is at a phone booth calling home to tell his family that he loves them. After the call, he tries to cut his wrists, but he can't do it because he's afraid. As he exits the booth, he spots Jack across the street telling him to follow him into a movie theater that shows adult films. So he buys a ticket and heads in and sees Jack sitting in the back, and we also see 4 other guys in there watching the movie. Talk about awkward. Why would you even watch that kind of movie in a theater with other guys in the first place? Anyway, Jack is looking much worse and looks more decomposed. David sits down next to him and starts talking to him and asking him if he's going to say that he told him so, but he says that he would if he was still alive, but does say that he did indeed tell him so though. He tells Jack that he doesn't remember killing those people, and Jack asks him what about the zoo, and he tells him that he's crazy enough to do that whether he was a werewolf or not, and Jack tells him that he wants him to meet some people, and he goes on to introduce him to his victims from last night, and he tells them that he's really sorry, and they tell him that he needs to commit suicide so they can be freed, and so that no more people end up like them, and they give him ideas on how to commit suicide. Soon night falls, and he transforms in the theater into a werewolf and kills everyone inside. The police try to keep him from escaping the theater, but he ends up breaking out and killing a lot of people, and even decapitating that old mean detective guy, and causing tons of accidents that end up getting people killed. It's just full-on chaos at this point. What would you do if you were in a situation like that where it's just pure chaos all around you? David runs down an alley not realizing that it's a dead end, and the cops corner him there and they're ready to shoot him, but Alex arrives and pushes her way through the crowd of people and officers, and she walks up to him and tells him that she loves him. But just as he's about to attack her, the cops shoot him and he's killed, which turns him human again. And Alex starts crying in despair, and then the movie ends. The werewolf from the classic movie was physically strong enough to rip the bars off of a barred window. Although his animal instincts mostly took over, he still demonstrated some intelligence. For example, he waited until his victims were alone before he would attack them, and he tried to disguise his appearance. The transformation phase from human to werewolf is gradual, but kind of fast, and looks like it's not painful. I like the overall creature design of the werewolf. It feels like more of a softer version of a werewolf because it doesn't look too menacing, but it doesn't look harmless either. It's like a middle ground between the two. Also, it has more of a humanoid wolf form. Overall, I give its creature design 6 creature claws out of 10. In comparison, the modern werewolf is physically strong enough to break through a metal door. It can move very quickly and can chase down its prey with ease. It mostly runs on pure animal instinct and doesn't demonstrate any intelligence. It's also an opportunistic killer. Its transformation phase from human to werewolf is slow and looks very agonizing and very painful because its whole skeleton is getting reshaped and rearranged to fit its new form. I like its creature design because it gives off that whole body horror vibe and it looks menacing. It looks more like a wolf but bigger and more vicious. Overall, I give its creature design 8 creature claws out of 10. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please feel free to smack that like and subscribe button and click on that notification bell so you can be notified when I post new videos. You can also follow me on Instagram. The link is in the description box below. Also, if you'd like to watch the movies I talked about today and enjoy them for yourselves, I have links down below in the description box to where you can buy or rent them. As a disclaimer, the links are affiliate links, so if you use them to buy or rent any of the movies, or to buy anything in general, using my links will earn a small commission from it at no extra cost to you. This has been the Creature Junkie. Farewell for now, my dear friends, and I hope to see you in my next video. Or else.